Amara's given away, like a burden finally lifted, by her family to a groom so poor he can't even afford his bride a clean dress. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the village square of Oma, but the heat of the sun was nothing compared to the searing heat of shame radiating from Amara's skin. She stood paralyzed in the center of the dusty aisle, a spectacle for a community that had traded their compassion for cruel entertainment. Her wedding dress, once a cheap but hopeful white, was now a map of her family's hatred. It was gray with wood smoke soot and brown with the muddy water her stepmother had accidentally splashed on her while she was forced to scrub the porch just an hour before the ceremony. "Look at the Queen of Rags," a voice shrieked from the crowd, followed by a tidal wave of jagged laughter. Amara's head remained bowed, her eyes tracing the jagged tear in her lace sleeve, a tear her father had made when he dragged her toward the village elders. To her left, the village girls she once played with stood in vibrant, shimmering Ankara fabrics, their fans fluttering like the wings of judgmental butterflies. They didn't see a bride. They saw a warning of what happens when favor leaves a house. Every finger pointed at her was a needle pricking her spirit. The mockery was so loud it felt like a physical weight, pressing her shoulders down until she felt as small as the dust motes dancing in the light. She felt the heavy gaze of her stepmother, who stood with arms folded, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. For her, this wasn't a wedding, it was a garbage disposal. Suddenly, the laughter reached a deafening crescendo as a figure approached from the edge of the square. It was Patrick. He moved with a quiet, deliberate pace, his worn leather sandals slopping softly against the dry earth. His trousers were faded to the color of old bark, and his simple shirt bore the patches of many seasons of hard labor. The villagers didn't hold back. They howled at the sight of him. "The beggar has found his match," someone yelled, 2 zeros making a circle of nothing. Amara's breath hitched in her throat. She expected to see a man looking as humiliated as she felt, a man who would look at her with resentment for the burden she had become. But as Patrick stepped into the circle of mockery, he didn't look at the villagers. He didn't even acknowledge the insults that were being hurled like stones. Instead, he walked straight to Amara. For the first time that day, someone looked at her without disgust. When she finally risked a glance upward, she didn't see the ghost the village spoke of. She saw eyes that were deep, calm, and oddly piercing, eyes that seemed to see right through her stained dress and into the broken girl beneath. He reached out a hand, his fingers steady and warm. In that moment, the roar of the crowd seemed to fade into a dull hum. As his hand closed around Amara's, Amara felt a strange, terrifying spark of hope. The village thought they were witnessing her end, but as she looked into Patrick's unwavering gaze, she realized that this path of thorns might be leading somewhere her family could never follow. The dust of Oma village finally began to settle behind them, but the echoes of the villagers' laughter still rang in Amara's ears like a persistent fever. She walked several paces behind Patrick, her head low, the hem of her ruined wedding dress dragging through the red dirt, collecting thorns and burrs. Every step away from the only home she had ever known felt like a step into a dark abyss. She carried her meager belongings in a small, frayed bundle, feeling less like a bride and more like a prisoner being led to a distant cell. The journey was long and silent. They bypassed the main motor parks where the wealthy traveled, instead boarding a cramped, rickety bus filled with laborers and market women. Amara squeezed herself against the window, trying to hide her tear-stained face and the stained lace of her sleeves from the curious stares of the other passengers. She expected Patrick to ignore her, or perhaps to grumble about the burden he had just inherited to settle a debt. After all, that's how the men in her village behaved. But as the bus jolted over the deep potholes of the countryside, she felt a gentle pressure on her shoulder. She flinched instinctively, but Patrick didn't strike or shout. Instead, he reached into his worn satchel and pulled out a small, clean plastic bottle of water and a wrap of roasted ground nuts. "You haven't eaten since yesterday," he said softly. His voice wasn't the rough growl of the laborers she knew. It was steady and possessed a strange melodic calm. "Drink. The city is still far and you need your strength." Amara looked at the water and then at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Why are you being kind to me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "My own father gave me away like a piece of refuse. The whole village laughed at my shame. Why don't you laugh too?" Patrick leaned back against the hard plastic seat, his eyes fixed on the passing trees. For a moment, the weary laborer disappeared, replaced by a man of immense quiet authority. "A diamond dropped in the mud is still a diamond, Amara," he replied, never taking his eyes off the horizon. "The mud is the shame of those who threw it there, not the stone itself. They laughed because they only see the surface. I see the heart." For the first time in 5 years, the knot of cold terror in Amara's chest began to loosen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Patrick took his own tattered jacket and draped it over her shivering shoulders. It smelled of hard work and earth, but also of a strange, comforting safety. As she drifted into a fitful sleep against the vibrating window of the bus, she realized that while the village had sent her away to be punished, this poor man was treating her with the tenderness that no amount of gold in Oma could buy. She was traveling toward a shack in a city she feared, but for the first time, she wasn't traveling alone. The city was a sprawling, chaotic beast that roared with the sound of engines and the frantic energy of millions, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of Oma. When they finally arrived at their destination, Amara's heart sank. It was a dense settlement on the outskirts where the houses were made of rusted corrugated iron and mismatched wooden planks. Patrick led her to a small, isolated room at the back of a bustling compound. The walls were unpainted, the floor was cold cement, and the only furniture was a thin mattress tucked into a corner and a single wooden stool. Amara stood in the doorway, still wearing her stained wedding dress, looking like a displaced spirit in a graveyard of poverty. She looked at the peeling walls and the small kerosene stove on the floor. This was the city life her father had mocked. She felt a familiar sting in her eyes. "So, this is it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "From one prison to another." Patrick set down her small bundle of clothes and walked over to the single tiny window that looked out over the crowded rooftops. He didn't look like a man defeated by his surroundings. He stood with his back straight, his presence filling the cramped room with a strange, unyielding dignity. He turned to her, and the flickering light of the communal hallway cast long shadows across his face. "I know what this looks like, Amara," he said, his voice low and resonant. "It looks like the end of the road. It looks like the village was right about me." He stepped closer, reaching out to take her small, trembling hands in his large, callous ones. "But look at me. Look into my eyes." Amara looked up, expecting to see shame, but she found only a burning, focused intensity. "This room is just a temporary stop," he continued firmly. "It is a test for the world, but for you and me, it is a foundation. I promise you, by the honor of the mother who raised me, that these walls will not hold us forever. Better days are coming, Amara. Days so bright they will make you forget the darkness of Oma. Can you trust me for just a little while longer?" Amara looked at the man the world called a pauper, and for the first time she saw a king in disguise. She didn't understand how or when things would change, but the sincerity in his voice acted as an anchor for her drifting soul. She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress, the cold cement floor beneath her didn't feel quite so hard, and the darkness of the shock felt less like a tomb and more like a cocoon. She went to sleep clinging to a single whispered promise that the man beside her was not who the world thought he was. To help support their meager existence, Amara found work as a cleaner at a high-end commercial complex downtown. Every morning she scrubbed the marble floors and polished the glass of offices she felt unworthy to even enter. She did this without complaint, often wearing the same faded dress and worn-out slippers, fueled only by the quiet encouragement Patrick gave her every evening. One afternoon, while she was kneeling to scrub a stubborn stain near the executive elevators, a pair of polished leather shoes stopped inches from her hands. She looked up into the face of a man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. This was Chief Collins, a wealthy businessman known for his predatory charm and immense fortune. He didn't look at her with the mockery of the villagers. Instead, his eyes traveled over her with a predatory hunger that made her skin crawl. "A beautiful flower shouldn't be found in the dirt," he said, his voice smooth like expensive silk. He reached out, offering a hand to help her up, but Amara pulled back, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "I am a married woman, sir. I am happy with my work." Chief Collins let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the lobby. "Married? I have seen the man you live with. I know that shack you call a home. I've seen him trudging through the mud in clothes that belong in a furnace. Is that what you call happiness, shivering at night and smelling of kerosene?" He stepped closer, the scent of his expensive cologne overpowering the smell of her cleaning bleach. "Leave that beggar. I can give you a mansion with 10 servants. I can give you jewels that would make your village elders blind with envy. You could have the world, Amara. All you have to do is walk away from that loser." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of high-denomination notes, holding them out so the crisp paper brushed against her hand. Amara stared at the money. It was more than she had seen in her entire life. It was the price of 1,000 dreams, a ticket out of the shock and away from the smell of poverty. For a fleeting second, the image of her village mocking her flashed in her mind, and the temptation to finally have everything tugged at her heart. But then she remembered Patrick's eyes, the way they held her with respect, the way he shared his only bottle of water on the bus, and the steady promise he had made in their tiny room. "My husband is not a loser," she said, her voice growing stronger as she stood up to face the tycoon. "He is a man of honor, and honor cannot be bought with your paper." She turned back to her bucket, her heart hammering against her ribs, leaving the billionaire standing there with his useless gold, unaware that he had just been rejected for a man he thought was worth nothing. Chief Collins did not take rejection lightly. The following evening, as Amara walked toward the bus stop to return to her humble home, his sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up beside her, forcing her to stop. He stepped out, leaning against the polished door with a look of cold amusement. In his hand, he held a velvet box, which he snapped open to reveal a necklace of shimmering diamonds that caught the dying light of the sun. "I decided to visit your little neighborhood today," Collins said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I saw him, Amara. I saw your man of honor hauling sacks of cement at a construction site like a common beast of burden. His face was covered in white dust, and his shirt was so torn I could see the ribs of a starving man." He laughed, a sound as sharp as glass. "He is a beggar, Amara, a common laborer who can't even afford to buy his wife a clean dress to replace that rag you wore on your wedding day." Amara felt a sting of tears in her eyes, not because she was ashamed of Patrick, but because of the sheer cruelty in the businessman's voice. She looked down at her own faded clothes, then back at the diamonds in the box. "Look at yourself," Collins continued, stepping closer until he was blocking her path. "You are beautiful, but you smell of cheap soap and hard work. Why stay with a man who can only offer you a life of dirt? If you come with me tonight, I will burn those clothes and wrap you in silk. I will give you a name that people fear and respect. Why choose a beggar over a king?" Amara took a deep breath, her hands trembling but her gaze finally steady. She thought of how Patrick looked at her every night, not as a beautiful flower in the dirt, but as a partner, a queen, and a soul worth protecting. She thought of how he went without his own meal just so she could have a piece of meat in her soup. "You call him a beggar because you only see his hands, but I see his heart. He may not have a car to block my path or diamonds to buy my silence, but he has a spirit that is wealthier than all your bank accounts combined." She stepped around him, her head held high. "He couldn't buy me a new dress today, but he gave me his dignity, and that is something you will never be able to afford." She walked away, leaving the tycoon standing in the shadow of his expensive car. As she headed toward the shack she shared with Patrick, she realized the dirty clothes no longer felt like a burden. They felt like armor. She was being tested, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and exactly who she loved. Chief Collins stood stunned as Amara took a step back, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen in the village or the city. He looked down at the diamond necklace in his hand, then at the girl in the faded, dusty dress, unable to comprehend why his wealth hadn't acted as the ultimate magnet. To him, everything had a price, and a girl from a shack should have been the cheapest purchase of all. "You are making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life," Collins hissed, his charm finally evaporating to reveal a bitter, ugly arrogance. "You are choosing a life of hunger. You are choosing to be a nobody tied to a man who will never be more than a footstool for people like me. Look at your hands, Amara. They are rough and scarred. 1 week with me and you would never lift a finger again." Amara didn't flinch. She felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if the shame that had weighed her down since the wedding day in Oma had finally evaporated. She looked at the expensive car, the gold rings on his fingers, and the cold, hollow expression in his eyes. "You talk about my hands being rough," Amara said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the evening air. "But these hands work for the man I love. Patrice's hands are scarred too, but they are the hands that hold me with respect. They are the hands that share the little he has without making me feel like a burden." She stepped closer to him, her shadow falling across his polished shoes. "You think you are a king because of what you have, but you are a fool because of who you are. I would rather eat sand with a man of honor like Patrice than eat gold at the table of a man who thinks he can buy a human soul." Collins opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The girl in the dirty clothes now looked down on the billionaire. Amara didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on him and began to walk away, her pace brisk and confident. Every step toward the outskirts of the city felt like a victory march. The mockery of the villagers, the stains on her wedding gown, and the daily grind of the city no longer mattered. She had chosen her side. As she neared the small shack, she saw the dim glow of the kerosene lamp through the window and the silhouette of Patrice waiting for her. She realized then that she wasn't going home to a pauper. She was going home to the only man who had ever truly seen her worth. The test was over, though she did not yet know that the man waiting inside was about to change her world forever. The following morning, the usual heavy silence of the outskirts was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the slums. It was the low, rhythmic thrum of powerful engines, a mechanical heartbeat that made the ground tremble. Amara, who was busy folding the thin mattress, hurried to the door as neighbors began to spill out of their shacks in wonder. Stretching down the narrow, dusty road was a fleet of 6 gleaming black SUVs, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dark diamonds. The lead vehicle came to a halt directly in front of their humble shack. A man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit stepped out, but it wasn't Chief Collins. The man hurried to the rear door, bowing his head in deep respect as he opened it. Amara's breath caught in her throat as a figure stepped out. He was wearing a suit that looked as though it were woven from shadows and moonlight, his posture commanding and regal. For a moment, Amara didn't recognize him until she saw his eyes, the same deep, piercing eyes that had looked at her with tenderness on the bus. It was Patrice. He was no longer covered in the white dust of the construction site. He stood there as the very definition of power. "Patrice?" Amara whispered, her voice lost in the gasps of the gathered crowd. He walked toward her, the expensive fabric of his trousers brushing against the dry weeds of the compound. He reached out and took her hands, his touch still warm, still steady. "I told you better days were coming, Amara," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of a man who owned empires. Behind him, the man in the suit stepped forward and addressed the stunned neighbors. "You are looking at Mr. Patrice Sterling, CEO of Sterling Global. He has been away on a mission of the heart." Patrick looked deeply into Amara's confused eyes. "My family's wealth has always attracted people who loved my shadow, not my soul. I made a vow that I would not marry until I found a woman who would stand by me when I had nothing, a woman who would choose a laborer over a billionaire. You were mocked, you were humiliated, and you were tempted with gold, yet you chose me in my rags." He signaled to one of his assistants, who stepped forward with a box. Inside was a dress made of pure white silk, embroidered with real pearls, a gown that made her old wedding dress look like a distant, fading nightmare. "My mission is over, Amara," he whispered, kissing her knuckles. "Yesterday you defended a beggar. Today the world will see that you have always been a queen. We are leaving this place, and we are never looking back." The dusty road leading into Oma had not changed, but the wind that swept through it today carried the scent of a brewing storm. The villagers heard the motorcade before they saw it, a rhythmic, heavy thundering that shook the earth and brought every man, woman, and child to the roadside. In a place where a single bicycle was a possession and an old motorcycle was luxury, the sight of 10 black, bulletproof SUVs gliding through the red dust like majestic predators was enough to stop the breath of the entire community. The convoy came to a halt in the very square where Amara had been humiliated weeks prior. The doors opened in perfect unison, and a team of security men in dark suits stepped out, forming a human corridor of iron and steel. Then, the door of the center vehicle swung upward. Amara stepped out, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd that was so sharp it sounded like a scream. She was no longer the girl in the soot-stained rags. She wore a gown of such blinding white that it seemed to glow with its own light, encrusted with thousands of tiny diamonds that shimmered like 1,000 stars captured in silk. Her hair, once matted and neglected, was styled in an elegant crown, and her skin radiated the glow of a woman who had finally found peace. Beside her, Patrick stood tall, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. He wore a suit that cost more than the village's entire harvest, but his eyes remained fixed only on Amara. The crowd parted in terror and awe as they walked toward her father's compound. Her stepmother stood by the door, her jaw dropped so low she looked grotesque, her hands trembling as she clutched a dirty rag, the same kind of rag she had once forced Amara to wear. Her father, smelling of the same cheap gin, stumbled forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of greed and fear. "Amara, my daughter," he stammered, reaching out a shaky, desperate hand toward the diamonds on her sleeve. I knew that man was special. I gave you to him because I wanted the best for you." Amara stopped, her gaze as cold and clear as ice. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. The silence she commanded was more powerful than a scream. "You didn't give me to him for my good. You sold me to settle a debt. You threw me away like refuse because you thought I was worth nothing." She looked at her stepmother, who was now shrinking back against the wall. "And you laughed while I stood in the dirt." Amara signaled to one of the assistants, who stepped forward with a small plain envelope. "There is enough money in here to rebuild this house and feed you for a year. It is the last thing you will ever receive from me. You saw a beggar, but Patrick saw a queen. Today I am leaving Oma forever, not as a victim of your cruelty, but as the owner of the destiny you tried to steal." She turned her back on them without waiting for a reply, the diamonds on her back flashing a final blinding light as she stepped back into the car, leaving the village in a cloud of dust and the heavy, suffocating silence of regret. The shadows of Amara had finally been chased away by the dawn of a new life. In the heart of the city, inside the grand ballroom of the Sterling ancestral estate, a true celebration of love was unfolding. This time, there was no red dust, no mocking laughter, and no stained lace. The air was filled with the scent of 1,000 white lilies and the soft melodic swell of a live orchestra. Amara stood before a floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror, looking at the woman staring back. She wore a masterpiece of ivory satin that flowed around her like a gentle river, her neck adorned with the very diamonds she had once been tempted with. Only this time, they weren't a bride for her loyalty, but a symbol of her husband's gratitude. Beside her stood Patrick, looking every bit the king the world now knew him to be. He reached out, his hand resting on her waist, and leaned in to whisper against her ear. "You were beautiful in the village, Amara, but today you shine with the light of a woman who knows she is loved." As they stepped out into the ballroom to the thunderous applause of dignitaries, business icons, and friends, the atmosphere was one of pure reverence. They danced not as a master and a servant, nor as a billionaire and a lucky girl, but as equals who had survived the fire together. When the music slowed, Patrick took the microphone, his eyes never leaving Amara's face. "Many people see the wealth of the Sterling family tonight," Patrick said, his voice echoing with pride. "But my greatest asset is the woman beside me. She chose a man she thought had nothing, and in doing so, she gave me everything." Amara took the microphone from him, her heart full. She looked out at the guests, but her message was for everyone who had ever felt discarded. "For a long time, I believed my story ended in a dusty village square. I thought I was only worth the labor of my hands. But Patrick taught me that a queen isn't defined by her clothes, but by her courage." She paused, her smile widening as she looked at her husband. "And today, I am starting a new chapter. With Patrick's support, I am returning to school to study medicine. I want to build hospitals for the girls who are still waiting for their voices to be heard. I am no longer just a bride. I am a woman with a mission." The room erupted in a standing ovation that felt like a healing rain. As Patrick pulled her into a final tender embrace, Amara realized that the dirty wedding clothes had simply been the cocoon for the butterflies she had become. The village had intended to break her, but their cruelty had only led her to the throne she was born to occupy. Beside her billionaire king, the girl from Omara was finally home.